Good evening. My name is Allison Insel. I'm the manager of public programs at the Connecticut River Museum, and I want to welcome you to CRM Talks. This is our special Estuary Magazine speaker series, the first of four lectures put on by the magazine. So thank you for joining us. Tonight's lecture will be led by Dick Shriver, the publisher of Estuary Magazine and a longtime friend of our wonderful museum. Tonight he'll speak about the Connecticut River watershed, past, present, and future. Dick Shriver has a degree in mechanical engineering and a master's degree in industrial engineering. He has held executive positions in government and industry, having been Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department and Senior Vice President of Chase Manhattan Bank. He has been a professor of business finance and marketing at the International Management Institute in Kiev, Ukraine. He is provost emeritus of the European College of Liberal Arts, now Bard College, Berlin, and is currently head coach of girls varsity lacrosse at Old Saybrook High School. Dick is happy to take questions along the way. We encourage you to use the chat box at the bottom of the screen, or you're welcome to hold your questions until the end. But without further ado, I want to welcome Dick Shriver to our speaker series.
Thank you, Allison. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me. Is it nodding affirmative? Thanks very much. And thanks to you, Jennifer, and the Connecticut River Museum for this series, which is 4 presentations this year. And this is the overview. And you'll hear in the other presentations details. So this is an overview of the history of the Connecticut River watershed, the geological history, the first people, the colonists, the Industrial Revolution and what that brought about. And the river became ill in the 50s and 60s. It was sick and needed care. And that care came through political change. We'll talk a little bit about that. And so today the river is very much on the mend. There are lots of advocates, lots of work going on. We want to cover some of that. And then how does the future for the river look? And when Allison mentioned Estuary Magazine, and you'll note in the chat box that there are actually 2 hyperlinks or links whereby you can go to the website. The first one is in error. So if you do want to go to the website of the magazine, click on the second. I hope that works. So, and as Allison said, if there are any questions of clarification, please, can they go off mute by themselves, Allison? I guess the answer is
yes, they should be able to.
Okay, so you can put yourself off mute and interrupt anytime if there's a question of clarification and other questions that are of unique interest to you, we can save toward the end. So with that, let's take the first slide and just take a look at how the river looks. So, well, this is a lovely island, and the river is beautiful. As you all know, it's 409 miles roughly from here to from Old Saybrook to the Canadian border, where it starts. But as you look at the river, it's beautiful, but you can't tell what's underneath the surface. The water looks beautiful, but who knows what's going on underneath. There are enormous tides at this end of the river in the so-called estuary, which goes up towards Middletown. And when you look microscopically at this water, there could be any number of contaminants, and at different times there have been enormous contaminants in the river. And that's something that we'll talk about. Geologically, next, please. Geologically, the river wasn't here. It was a lake. It was called Lake Hitchcock. And you can see the river falls almost 1,500 feet from Canada to Old Saybrook, but it falls very quickly at the northern end and very gradually at the southern end. And at one time, you can see it was all one giant lake with a geological dam, really, at just halfway between here and the Massachusetts border, between Essex and the Massachusetts border, roughly. And that was 12,000 years ago. That dam broke, and we had the river, which is the next slide. And the watershed, as shown here, is about twice the size of Connecticut, with over 2 million people living in the watershed. And science has said that is beginning to conclude that watersheds are an important way to look at a river. Certain rivers like the Mississippi, like the Delaware River, and the Susquehanna River, the Chesapeake Bay, and so on, that a watershed is important from a scientific standpoint, more important than the political boundaries, the boundaries of the states. And so that's what we'll concentrate on this evening. Next. So people lived here for 5,000 years before the colonists came from Europe. They lived, I think, rather relatively peacefully, not totally. They had their spats. I have actually seen a 2,000-year-old lacrosse stick. They settled disputes with lacrosse games, a kind of a lacrosse game. And sometimes they fought each other in battle, but they were here for 5,000 years. And the watershed was a living water with ample food and vegetation. And then things started to happen. But before we get to that, let's take a look at the next slide. They had their own structures. Typically, a family would have two of these, one for the winter and one for the summer. They're not commodious by today's terms, but they were quite comfortable. And they had a means of transportation. Next slide. This is a canoe built by Jim Dyna up in right on the Massachusetts-Connecticut border. And he built that canoe about 20 or 30 years ago using only materials and tools that were available to the first people, to the Native Americans. He still has that canoe. It's dried out a little bit, but he took that canoe down a large part of the river, and people every year canoe or paddle or one person's even swimming the length of the river this year. So they had transportation, they had currency, they had multiple canoes. They would be 2 or 3 or 4 canoes at one location. If you happened by, you could take a canoe, take it across the river, and leave it on the other side. They could move pretty rapidly up and down the river too. So then we had Adrian Block. Next. In 1614, he was cruising up the coastline and came in and basically discovered the Connecticut River, the first colonist to discover it, on the Onrus, a replica of which is at the museum today, and you can take a trip on that ship. The interesting thing about the Onrus is that Adrian Block's first boat caught fire and burnt in Manhattan in 1613. And the amazing thing is that with no tools, no saws, no battery-powered drills or anything, and really no craftsmen, just with the crew he had and Native Americans that he met, he was able to rebuild a boat, to build a boat roughly the size of the current Onrus that you see at the museum. And he was the first colonist, and he went all the way to up towards Hartford, but that then was stopped by the river. Next, the colonists arrived in the late after 1614. They began to come, and the Native Americans and the colonists began to interact. And here's a name that we should all remember. Massasoit was chief of the Wampanoags. And incredibly, he moderated between half a dozen Indian tribes and the colonists in a peaceful environment from 1620 until 1660. It's an incredible story. Then he died, and his son, King Philip, felt betrayed. Trust between colonists and the Indians began to break down, and he declared war on the colonists in what was called. He took a colonist's name. His name was King Philip, and you've heard of King Philip's War. No relation to Prince Philip, of course, but King Philip didn't continue the good relationship with the colonists, and King Philip's War was ended in a disaster for the Native Americans, and that was basically the end of Indian dominance in what's New England today. So if you take a look at the next slide, this kind of a map appeared in 1700, and you can see where we are today is labeled an area cleared of Indians. It's hard to believe today, but that's the way it was, and it's quite a history, and much has been written about it. In our magazine, we like to get Native Americans to write about their history. I will tell you, it's not easy to get them to do this. So if you know of any that are so disposed, we'd love to talk to them. But what they're really good at is talking. They're passing down their oral history from one period to the next. And typically they don't like to write. That's been our experience. At any rate, we have a few exceptions, and we'd like a few more. But so that period was a difficult period. And then we have the beginning of the Industrial Revolution at that same time. And these are things that brought enormous prosperity to the area, to the region. Dams. There are probably 23 or 24 large dams on the Connecticut River and a couple of tributaries. Farms, particularly sheep farms, dominated. And of course, most of the area was all forest when the colonists first arrived, and land was developed for various purposes. So it brought prosperity, but it also brought some problems. Next, yeah. So this is one of a couple dozen dams, a big dam in the river up in the Vermont-Massachusetts border. And those dams produce power, initially just mechanical power and then electrical power. And you can see in the background the Yankee atomic power plant that was shut down some years ago, but that was the reservoir for the atomic power plant also. But this made it difficult for fish to get upstream to spawn. And the anadromous fish that spawn upriver and then go out into the ocean for a year or many years, and then try to come back to the place where they were born so they can recreate themselves. These dams made it very tough. We'll talk some more about that. And then we had the sheep farms. Just maybe 140 years ago, the watershed was 25% forested. And then perhaps because of greater efficiencies in New Zealand or wherever, whoever was able to grow sheep more economically than they were being grown here in the watershed, replaced it. And that's one of the good stories of the past 150 years, is that the forests that were depleted to 25% of the watershed, today they're about 80%. The watershed is about 80% forested. Next slide. And here are the things that happened. Waste disposal was seen as a legitimate use by the majority of people, by the majority of businesses, by the majority of households and farms. Second, next please. Habitats for wildlife and fish were destroyed and damaged. Enjoyment of the river was stunted. And I'll show you some graphic photographs of that. And the Connecticut River became known as America's best landscape sewer, suitable only for transport of industrial and municipal waste. So this is two people coming down the Connecticut River in the late 50s. And there were parts of the river where people either wanted to or had to wear a gas mask. And those would be in the major cities along the way, where there were sewage just being pumped right into the river. Next. Basically a wasteland. People didn't care. There were junkyards all up and down the river, and this sort of thing. It just was lacking tender, loving care. Next. And we say the river became seriously ill. The salmon, the Atlantic salmon, which was in the millions and abundant supply during indigenous times, basically disappeared. And the unfortunate thing about the salmon, while there's a lot of restoration work going on, once the pattern of behavior was broken for the salmon, as people began to develop fishways and ways for fish to get upriver, the salmon are not coming back. If they do, in the next 10 or 20 years, it'll be a surprise to the scientists that are working on it. It was just too much to expect them to recreate those incredible habits based on senses of smell and detection of microchemicals and so on in the water to find the place where they were born. It's an incredible bit of scientific history. And a lot of the wildlife disappeared. Next. Of course, the beaver, it was a form of currency, an incredible abundance of beaver on the Connecticut River. And that's another set of stories that are interesting. So we say that following a long illness, and while she will never be quite the same, the Connecticut River is on the mend today with many helping hands, once again becoming a living water. And I wanted to cite the attending physicians. This is kind of interesting. Nobody else is going to show you these 6, 7 people in one slide. There was a fire on the Cuyahoga River. I think it was 1959 or 1960 or something. And it made the news. And suddenly people realized the fire was started by a coal that blew off of a steam engine into the Cuyahoga River. And there was so much petroleum on the surface of the river that it caught fire. And that became a cause célèbre of pollution in major rivers throughout the country. So there was political pressure to do something about it, and Richard Nixon was president at the time, and he created the EPA, and Bill Ruckelshaus at the bottom below him was the first head of EPA. Followed rather quickly and suddenly by Gerald Ford, and then Jimmy Carter and Doug Kossel underneath Jimmy Carter. Doug Kossel had been deputy commissioner of DEEP in Connecticut under the man to the far to the far right, Dan Lufkin, who still lives in Connecticut today. So Connecticut contributed the third head of the EPA in Doug Kossel. And the transition from Ruckelshaus to Kossel, the rules of EPA went from voluntary to compulsory. Suddenly there were fines. The average citizen could complain about sewage going directly into the river by a pipeline. And Jimmy Carter came in 1978. By the early 80s, the Connecticut River was beginning to clean up a bit, and by 1985 or 96, the river was swimmable and boatable. Not potable or drinkable, but swimmable and boatable, with no places where you had to wear a gas mask. Next. So this is what happened in the mid to late 70s. EPA was created. Congress passed some amendments to the Clean Water Act of 1948. In other words, it existed. There was some consciousness and awareness that something had to be done, but there were no teeth and there was no organization. It was a group of smaller offices scattered throughout government that were brought together under the Environmental Protection Agencies. Penalties were imposed and enforcement of those penalties, of those rules. And by 1985, we had a river that looked a lot like what it is today. Next. So here's a list of the kinds of things that are going on. And this is kind of an important list. Power plant, there are, I think, five of those power plants and the dams where they are located are being recertified this year and probably into next year. Those recertifications by the federal government will last for 40 to 50 years. So people are busy working on those recertifications to say that if there's a chance that these power plants can do something to improve the habitat for fish, to improve the opportunity for fish to move upstream, they should do it now, because the next opportunity will be 40 years from now. They've also discussed, and I don't know the status of that, I hope we'll know by the end of this year, if a power company goes out of business, they may be required to tear the dam down in accordance with the rules, or at least to provide a big opening to the dam. There are over 2,000 dams total in the Connecticut River watershed, something like that. So dam removal is a big deal, and it differs depending upon the size of the dam. Water quality, we'll get to that in a minute too, is monitored all up and down the river for chemicals, both good and bad. Fish populations, I mentioned that salmon are not coming back, but shad are coming back, and other fish are coming back, and they may come back in full throat. The farms are much better managed today in terms of the runoff of chemicals, pesticides, and so on. And forests are being managed for continuity of growth and area covered by trees. A lot of work on eradicating the non-native invasive plants. The so-called NER is a new event, really in the last month, where the Department of Commerce, the NOAA division of the Department of Congress, has agreed to make Connecticut, I think it's the 30th National Estuarine Research Reserve, otherwise known as the NER. There are 29 other NERs in the US today, and now Connecticut River and the coastline up towards Groton, the estuary here, just the bottom part of the river between Essex and Old Saybrook, parts of that are now part of the NER of the Connecticut River. And this means that some money will be allocated to this area to provide information about the quality of water, about the quality of or the amount, the impact of getting rid of invasive plants in the area. So Lord Creek, right across the river from Essex, is part of the NER, and then it goes up into Groton and towards Stonington. Annual cleanups. There are no junkyards along the river today, but every year, an enormous amount of junk that floats down the river washes up on the coastlines, and the annual cleanups are held by various organizations along the river, principally the Connecticut River Conservancy up in Massachusetts. And much education and awareness. This is very much improved over the last 50 or 60 years. And that's part of why we started the magazine, so that people would know what's going on and be able to contribute resources and time and so on in areas that were of interest to them. A huge growth of land trusts. I think there were, just since World War II, there were 2 or 3, I think, before World War II, but explosive growth in the last 50 or 60 years. There are probably 100 land trusts in the watershed, Connecticut River watershed today, and they look at each other for best practices that can be adopted by seeing how others have done it. Next. So these are the organizations that look at the watershed, of which the Connecticut River Museum is one. The Silvio A. Conti National Fish and Wildlife Refuge is headquartered up in Sunderland, Mass., but it looks at the whole watershed, and that's the U.S. government spending money to bring about positive change all up and down the Connecticut River watershed. I mentioned the Connecticut River Conservancy, a nonprofit up in Greenfield, Massachusetts, headed by Dr. Andy Fisk, a good friend of the museum and a good friend of our magazine. Our magazine focuses on the watershed. And then, of course, we have the land trusts and many conservation NGOs, from the Nature Conservancy to Roger Torrey Peterson Estuary Center and so on. Next. So this is new. A study in which we participated and the museum participated, and about 30 organizations total up and down the watershed participated in a 1.5-year study of the potential for having a fund, probably a fund financed by the federal government, to bring organizations together to collaborate on ways to improve the impact on the river. This is in process, and we hope in the next year or two that this will be a rather large piece of the federal government allocation for the watershed area. Next. So we say the Connecticut River has no plans to retire. She loves her job. Next. She likes being pampered. She's happy with her rehabilitation program. Next. Here's part of the rehabilitation program. This is getting rid of the Phragmites on various wetlands in the lower part of the river. We have invasive plants, the water lily. Next. There are probably 10 invasive plants. When they take over, this particular lily has roots 10 feet long. And when it starts to grow, it's very hard to eradicate. And it's done mostly by people in kayaks, grabbing these plants and pulling them up by the roots and then loading them on boats and then onto a dock and then onto a truck and hauling them away. And of course, if you take a boat through these areas, some of that invasive plant sticks to the boat, so you have to wash the boat when you take it out of the water, or you'll be carrying the seeds of these plants to the next place where you launch your boat. But there are 8 or 9 invasive plants that are really destructive. They're non-native, so they came from somewhere else, and it would be better, for the most part, without them. Although Phragmites has an interesting story about how it's used elsewhere in the world. It has positive uses elsewhere in the world, but not here. Next. And scientists, this is scientists that came from the National Museum of Natural History in New York, came out to show us the microscopic, what's really in our water microscopically, and how do we measure the quality of the water from a biological standpoint or bacteria standpoint or chemicals or whatever. People are beginning to look at details such as this. It's very important. Next. And farms. We mentioned the sheep farms that where forests were destroyed to make way for the sheep. But this is a more modern farm growing vegetables up in Norwich, Vermont, the Norwich area on Norwich Loam, which this farmer says is the second best loam in the watershed, the best loam being the Hadley loam up in Hadley, Massachusetts. It's an organic farm right on the edge of the river up in Vermont, very productive and very good for the environment. Next. And I mentioned that 125 years ago, the watershed was 25% forested, and today it's 80%, 75 or 80% forested. So it's been a big comeback for the trees, and that's the one positive element that happened really because of economics. Next. People are tracking different wildlife. This young lady is tracking the fisher or the fisher cat. It's very hard to find the fisher cat or to see it in real life, but if she's putting a camera in the woods, different cameras in different parts of the woods with motion detectors and counting the number of fisher in that area. The fisher being a weasel. Next picture shows you the fisher. It's not a very nice animal, but it's kind of cute, I think. Next. This is Andy Fisk. This is on the Connecticut River Museum. What do you call it? The educational boat. But this is taking water samples for chemicals, oxygen, etc. in the water, which they do twice a month from May through October. And the next slide shows one result of this work. I hope you can see this. This is an interactive map. You can go to it today and see what it was at the end of last summer. But in May, this will start to be updated every other week. And the blue says this water is clean for swimming and boating. The yellow says boating only. The red says neither, and the black says they were unable to measure in those particular places that prior to the that season. But this is an interactive map, and there are probably 100 different locations, 7 of which are right outside the Connecticut River Museum. Next. This is a fishway up at Turner's Falls in Massachusetts. You can see that's a pretty long, that's just a piece of it. I think it's about 60 some feet that the fish have to climb up to get into the upper part of the river. And of course they're able to count these fish. So they know how many thousands by type that go up the fish ladder each year. And they're able to measure the improvement or the increase from one year to the next. At Holyoke, I would just mention, I haven't seen this myself, but I'd like to see it. The Holyoke Dam has 2 elevators The fish swim in as they're heading upstream. They swim into a lock, really. The door closes behind them, and the whole shooting match goes up 20 or 30 feet, and then the door opens on the other end, and the fish go out upriver. This is Steve Gephardt and Sally Harold. They make a living today. Actually, Steve's retired, but the two of them receive grants to tear down small dams. They do it personally. They also count fish and eels that pass certain points along the different tributaries. So that work is going on. Next. And then we have the osprey. I think 45, 50 years ago, the osprey was down to a couple of dozen pairs left in Connecticut part of the watershed. It was due to DDT, it was due to this, that, and the other thing, and scientists began to work on it. And of course, DDT was outlawed and banned. That helped. And then people began to build platforms. The next slide shows you one of the platforms that you've seen around the islands here. Extremely important part of the restoration of the osprey in the area. Osprey happens to like people maybe as much as people like the osprey. It's almost a iconic bird for the southern part of the Connecticut River. Next. So the Connecticut River is not retiring, likes her job, being pampered, and is optimistic about the future. Next. Enjoys people and other animals having fun in her presence. Next. Some of the best fly fishing anywhere can be found on tributaries of the Connecticut River. And much has been written about it, and much more will be written about it. And other sports. Take a look at a few here in succession. Next. If you go up into the Deerfield River, go back just for a second, if you can. Whitewater kayaking and canoeing and rafting up on the Deerfield River in the upper reaches of the Deerfield River that go up into Vermont even, is world class. You don't have to go to Austria. You can have plenty of excitement right here on the Connecticut River. Next. This picture was taken last October. It's the Wesleyan crew. It was a regatta held at Riverfront Recapture up near Hartford. Over 600 boats were in this regatta from 8 o'clock in the morning till 4:30 in the afternoon. So it's a very busy river recreationally today versus 50, 60 years ago. Although crew races have been held on the Connecticut River in various parts since the late 1800s. Next. Sailing, this is right down in Old Saybrook. Plenty of sailboats, plenty of boating on the Connecticut River. Next. Bobcats, wildlife. And next, we can keep going here a little bit. Herons, big year for herons last fall. Turkeys have come back. Turkeys were almost extinct throughout the US 50, 60 years ago. And through proper management of that particular beast, they've come back strong. There are plenty of them in this area. Wolves and ducks. There's a green-winged teal, and you can find them right around Essex this time of year. And Oliver Laplace in the next slide from, I think, Chester. He was one of the great guides, hunting guides on the Connecticut River, famous throughout New England and New York and New Jersey and so on. People came here to go hunting with him in this area. And hunters are a big part of caretakers of the environment. There are many rules about how many ducks you can shoot, even how many ducks you can shoot of a particular type. So you have to know what you're doing to go duck hunting along the river. But ducks and geese it's quite a popular activity. Next. And moose and spruce grouse, way up in the northern part of New Hampshire and Vermont. With climate change and increasing temperatures, they're moving farther north. There are about 3,000 or 4,000 moose left in the Connecticut River watershed, and but they are moving farther north, and they, maybe in 20 or 30 or 40 years, there'll be very few left. They'll have moved north into Canada, not because of anything that humans are doing to cause the moose to move north, but as the temperature rises, they're looking for colder weather. Same thing with the spruce grouse, a lovely bird. Next. So to conclude, the Connecticut River has no plans to retire, loves her job, likes being pampered, optimistic about the future, enjoys people, and looking forward to the next 12,000 years. So this is the sort of thing that we write about in our magazine. And if you have any questions about that I can answer, I'll do my best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If anyone would like to ask questions, just jump in. I'll check the chat box in the meantime.
Thank you for coming, by the way, everybody.
I don't see anything in the chat. Does anyone have any questions about the talk or about upcoming talks, or? I think you answered everyone's questions.
Impossible.
I know. Anyone? Let me just scroll. No, I don't think so.
I see Eric Lehman is here, so I know somebody can answer the tough questions.
Make it bigger.
Or you can you feel free to make a comment if you don't have a question.
Hello, hello.
Oh.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Dick. It's Joe Rhodes. How are you?
Hi, Joe. Nice to see you.
What a great presentation you've made here on this wonderful river. I love that you call her, and that she's not going to retire anytime soon, and that she loves us, and we certainly love her.
Yes.
It's a wonderful reference. It's and I wonder, just curiously, about Selden Cove. I know that there's this invasive lily up there, and that they were struggling with it. Is that part of the area that is being looked at carefully?
Are you talking about the water lily?
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's an ongoing battle.
Yeah.
You have the Friends of Whalebone Cove.
Yeah.
And they've been active in the Selden Creek area. And that's where, I didn't show a picture of it, but there'll be 10 or 15 kayaks out there for a few hours, a few times in the fall, of people pulling those nasty, but attractive lilies out of the water. But if you were to drive a boat in there with a motor, you're not going to get very far.
No.
So it's not friendly for boaters. It's not friendly for fishing. It's not friendly for any other vegetation, quite frankly. So they've been working for a number of years to eradicate it. And I think it's now down to a fairly modest, I don't want to speak, if anybody's on here from the Whalebone Cove.
Or he might miss it.
group. I think it's under control, but you have to go every year to pull out the growth that's just going to be there inevitably.
So I think I saw an article or read something about it that was curious. And are they developing any kind of a safe pesticide for that kind of thing, like you'd use in your garden?
I don't think so for the lily, but they do use a pesticide on the Phragmites. That's destroyed mechanically the first year, and then the second year there is a spray, a pesticide that's used because you don't need that much of it. I think that's the reason.
Yeah, okay. Well, so this is just an ongoing man versus attractive lily, but a beast underwater.
Yeah, but there are a bunch of others that, like the bittersweet and so on, that are equally pesky, and they just take over. And
Yeah.
the Phragmites you all are familiar with. I mean, nothing else can grow where Phragmites gets a foot in the door, so to speak. Nothing else can grow. They're what, 12, 13 feet high. That's the particular genus of Phragmites that we don't like and try to get rid of. And so nothing else can grow underneath them. There's no light. There's not enough room for anything else to grow in the base of the Phragmites. So it just keeps spreading out until it dominates and takes over. It doesn't grow uphill very far, but it does take over a wetland.
Yeah, well, right nearby you at the DEP, that wonderful walkway under Amtrak and out to the stand, you can really get a sense of just how rooted the Phragmites is when the tide is out. And there is a dense layer of root and mud, and then the water, sort of lapping up against it. There is really no way anything can get anywhere in that system to grow again.
I heard tales of how fast it grows horizontally.
Yeah,
Those roots will go horizontally. You can almost see them growing.
yeah. Well, anyway, I just wanted to say thank you. This is a terrific talk, and it's so inspiring because having grown up on this river, I appreciate being a little kid in the 60s and now being an adult and enjoying it so much more. We swim in it, we recreate in it, we sail in it, and it is a very unusual place, especially at the mouth, to have no commercial endeavors other than marinas and private homes. It's really unusual for a river.
Yeah, and I think most people might know this, Joe, but certainly you know it. The reason that there's no industry at the mouth of this river is that it silts up very rapidly. And if you dredged it today, you'd dredge it again next week. You wouldn't get. There's an enormous amount of water that goes out the mouth of this river, and then when the tide comes, it comes roaring back, and a lot happens underneath the water that we just don't see.
Yeah. Well, our friends on Griswold Point know that it's the coming and going of the seasons, and they see where they can come in and where they can go out and where they can't.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to sign off. Thank you so much. It's nice to see you.
Thank you.
Dick, this is Michael Ferguson. Would you be able to comment on
What happened to Michael?
Michael, there you go. You were muted for a second.
Hi, Dick. I'm wondering if you might be able to comment about Thatchbed Island, very close to the museum, and its future and some of the issues that are there present with that particular island in the river.
Well, there's a book about it. You're familiar with that book?
I am. I think it's the Essex Land Trust put it out, if I'm
Yes. They've been very active with the osprey, restoration of the osprey. And they've had, from time to time, or at least once, they had one of these cameras on the nest so they could observe. They can observe the osprey laying their eggs and hatching the small ones. So they're very fond. The Essex Land Trust has done a very good job of restoring the osprey to Thatchbed Island. That much I can tell you. the details, I think, would come from the people that wrote that book. I've forgotten the names of the authors, but we could find that for you. There's a lot of, I think it's mostly covered with Phragmites. The platforms are built so they go above the Phragmites. And that's all I know about Thatched Bed Island, really. I've never set foot on it, but I've paddled around it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just shrinking. And so I didn't know if you had any comments about that.
Oh, is it shrinking?
Yeah, apparently it is. And so there's questions about, what its future is, given the, the flow of the river, et cetera. So,
Well,
but that's fine.
well, just to comment on that, of course, in the Fenwick area, where Katharine Hepburn, right at her house, actually, there was some erosion and the possibility of a big chunk of that point being cut off from the mainland, so to speak, where the two lighthouses are. And they did what they did is they spent a couple of years and about $1 million to create a living coastline to preserve the fields and that point of land at Fenwick. If that a living coastline is something that maybe the Thatched Bed people or the Essex Land Trust people have thought about and done something about. I don't know if there's anybody in this group from the Essex Land Trust, but it'd be worth finding out.
I think we have Denise Savageau, who has a question or has her hand up.
Hi, Denise.
Yes. Yes. Hi, Dick. Love the Estuary magazine. I think it's a great magazine that's doing a great service for the Connecticut River. So the question I have is, how do you come up with the ideas for the different articles? And wondering if you're considering or planning an article for the 50th anniversary of not only the Clean Water Act, but the Connecticut Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Act.
I need your phone number. I could follow up on that. But I'd like to tell you how we come up with the articles that we do come up with. I saw Eric Lehman in the lineup here. I didn't really focus on looking for other authors, but Eric has written on almost every magazine, and he writes on something that he's interested in or something that we're interested in. We have 7 people who write a regular column on fish restoration or on science of the river. And we have a regular column on a menu, a recipe that hopefully goes with something that we also talk about in the magazine. So we have 7 regular columns, and then we have about 7 other articles that are, I'll say, customized. And we were worried about having enough content when we started a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so actually we started about a week before COVID, which I wouldn't recommend as a time to start a magazine. And so we couldn't have a meeting, and we had what we called the Big Zoom. And we had 23 or 4 people that would attend a quarterly Zoom meeting for an hour and a half. We try to make it efficient use of people's time. And, I'd love to hear what Eric thinks of it, because we'd have 22 or 3 people at that meeting, and we talk about this, that, and the other thing, and ideas just bubble to the surface. We didn't have one this last quarter because we have more articles that have been written than we've been able to publish. So the summer issue is booked, the fall issue is booked, and the winter issue is partly booked. And we try to have a variety. I think that's the main focus is variety. So we have about 7 or 8 completely different topics. We like to have articles, two articles in each magazine that appeal to people up in New Hampshire and Vermont, upriver. We like to have history. We like to have a person of history. And then we like to have the science and wildlife and so on. So variety and big photographs so you can immerse yourself in the topic with 1,000 to 2,000 words. So they're all short pieces pretty much, but that's been our philosophy. And I have to say that the big Zoom meetings were enormously productive. I don't know if Eric would like to say something on that, because I'd love to hear an author's view. I've never asked. Eric, are you still with us? Eric,
Yeah, I'm here, Dick. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting to have been there from the beginning with Estuary and seeing us sort of struggle to come up with how is this magazine gonna, you know, honor the river really, and then now it's exploded and everyone's just contributing so much. I have 4 articles I've written that haven't even come out yet. I mean, everyone's very excited, and it's you know, if it's a magazine, you know, whenever you explore any particular place, it could be a tiny little town, you end up drilling down and finding there's endless stories. And when it's an area as big as the Connecticut River watershed, well, we've got so many stories to tell, and I don't see us drying up anytime soon.
Thank you, Eric.
Anyone else? I'd like to just mention that we also are really excited at the museum. We're going to have a speaker around each of the release dates of the magazine. So our next estuary speaker will be right around the time that the magazine comes out, the next issue of the magazine comes out, all the way through the end of the year. So stay tuned on that. Any other questions or comments?
Is there anything in the chat? Oh, okay. No, I think not.
Chat? No. I reposted. Someone couldn't see the link to the subscribe. Can everyone see what I put there now? I reposted it, Dick, because I don't know if someone couldn't see it.
I hope you spelled estuary right.
I did. I took my time.
I see a question here. What are the uses of Phragmites? I think in India, Phragmites are used for roofing and housing and baskets, things to carry things in. It can be useful. There just aren't many basket makers left or demand for baskets in the watershed.
Let me just go
So I see a question here. I've heard we once had a native species of Phragmites. If that's true, is it still in existence? The answer is yes. It's a shorter version, and I would refer you to the spring issue, the green cover. If you've seen it, it's just out last week. And if you want one, I'll send you one. If anybody sends me an email, I'll send you a copy of the spring issue. And there's an article, a detailed article by Judy Preston, who knows what she's talking about when it comes to invasive plants. And I think she's been one of your speakers at the museum.
He has, and several times.
And she may speak again on our behalf and sometime
Yeah.
this year.
Let me see. Is there an animal that loves to eat them? Renee, someone asked if there's an animal that likes to eat them.
Eat what?
Phragmites.
No, that's a good question. If there is one, I don't know what it is. You can find marsh wren living in the base of the Phragmites. That's about the only other living, and it's usually at the coastline, at the shoreline. But nothing lives inside the Phragmites. The swallows, the annual migration of the swallows up on Goose Island, they land in the top of the Phragmites, but nothing lives in that darkness, that dense darkness. It's just mud, maybe some microscopic insects and so on, but nothing visible to the eye.
Anyone else? Questions?
I'm looking through
I know I'm going to.
Are there wolves in Connecticut? Yes. And Bill Hobbs writes in one of the columns on wildlife, and he wrote about the wolves. That's why we had a photograph of it. So that takes care of what I saw in the chat. So
Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us, and thank you, Dick, so much for the talk. It was amazing.
pleasure.
Um,
Thank you all. Yes, thank you very much.
And do check at ctrivermuseum.org. We'll have all the upcoming estuary speaker series lectures, as well as our own. Next month, we have our curator. We have a new exhibit opening April 8th. It's called Speed, the history of hydroplane racing from 1900 to 1940. It's really cool. And we've got some beautiful boats on loan from other museums. We also have author Richard Friswell, who will be presenting his book, Merchants of Deceit, that talks about the opium trade on the river. And that's it that I have for tonight. But thank you everyone very much for coming. And I hope to see some of you next month. And Dick, thank you so much. It's really an honor to have you speak, and it's our pleasure to have this great opportunity to have estuary speakers as part of our lineup. So thank you so much. Thank you all very much. And good night.